Welcome to Just Participation, a student-led podcast about democracy that centers on the experiences, knowledges, and creativities of people working to enact change around the world. We're recording from the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations, and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The topic of today's episode will be the first in a series that takes an in-depth look at technology and democracy. Technology holds the promise of expanding and strengthening the quality of democracy, but also of reproducing systematic inequalities and power imbalances within states and between them. Our first guest, who can only safely be identified as Cuz, grounds this episode on technology and democracy by drawing attention to the historical and continued weaponization of modern technologies against indigenous communities by settler colonial governments. Cuz also helps us in recognizing the creative ways technologies are utilized by indigenous movements to fight for change and to counter the attempts by police and governments to censor or disrupt their communications. Cuz, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, my Indian name is Lustig. Lustig Youngyak, Nikita Loda, Aneta Aga. That means my name is, he's looking for something or looking for it. I'm of the Bear Clan and United Nation Bear Clan. I live in the Niagara region, so I have the benefit of getting to play in both the American and the Canadian world, or get the full American-Canadian experience, so to say.
And you're involved a lot in the Land Back Lane and in some of the other sort of shows of resistance, we'll say. If you want to talk a little bit about that and what your experience has been like over the last couple of years, and
over the last couple of years, I think we've seen some dramatic steps with Land Back Lane from last year. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, Land Back Lane is the first time that we've actually gotten some support from the colonial, we'll say, the colonial settler state. Mm-hmm. Last year was marked 30 years that I've been involved with some sort of action or whatnot, and I'm 40 years old. Yeah. So that gives you an idea. 3/4 of my life. Yeah, been around. Whether it's protesting what's going on with OCA, trying to keep our rights at the borders, trying to keep our rights with border crossing, and the things that go along with that. The fact that the international separates our sovereign nation, and you can see some of that with the way the settler laws work. So, there's a line that goes through the Niagara River that's imaginary, that splits American citizens and Canadian citizens. But due to treaties, that line doesn't exist to the Haudenosaunee, because we resided on both sides of that border. But with the way things are going with terrorism and other issues in the world, they trample some of our rights in trying to protect themselves. So we've been dealing with this for the better part of 30 years, and unfortunately, it's the fight my grandparents had, their grandparents, and that gets us into residential schooling. My mother was the first generation not to attend residential school full time.
Oh wow.
Mm-hmm.
Did they do any sort of day schools on your reserve? Because that's what they did on my school, on my reserve, right?
That happened on the Oneida Res, and my grandmother had a house built that her dream house. They lived there for 6 months, and that's when 60 Scoop started happening.
Oh man!
So my grandmother packed everybody up, and they moved to Buffalo, New York.
What's the 60 Scoop there? Just explain a little bit to our listeners there.
The 60 Scoop is where the RCMP and OPP physically went on reserves with black paddy wagons, and they would actually scoop kids that were in the yard playing, or if your kid was outside playing, the black car could pull up and throw you inside. You're on your way to boarding school. You'd be lucky if your parents were told that you were going. So my mother told me stories about my grandmother telling her, growing up, if you see a black paddy wagon, run. Don't stop, just run. So, these are things that have been in our community for years. It kind of explains why even nowadays, most Native people are a little gun shy when it comes to cops. It's almost first nature to run, because that's what's instinctual due to residential schooling.
I kind of want to sort of get your general thoughts on democracy, and particularly the context of settler colonial projects in the United States and Canada.
Well, I think, honestly, I'm a huge fan of democracy. I think everybody's voice matters. Even traditionally, the way Haudenosaunee ran their longhouses, it was the chief and the grandmothers weren't necessarily the ones with the power. They were just a voice that all voices went through. So, like usually your chief was the last to eat type of thing, So it's our ways are very different than theirs. That being said, Benjamin Franklin stayed with the Oneida for 6 months before he went back to Philadelphia and penned the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. So those are teachings that they got directly from us about what a free man was. Because you have to keep in mind at that time they were coming from a monarch system, So their thing was taxation without representation. So really, what they did was they took our way of life, our great law, and applied it to themselves so that they could become free men. And in the process, they kept it for themselves and cut everybody else out. So in 1982 or something, I think it was, the Congress actually in the House of Congress there in the States, they actually recognized that their system is based off the Haudenosaunee Great Law. So even with the American symbolism, you can see Haudenosaunee symbolism all over it. The arrows in the eagle's hand, the olive branch in the opposite hand, that represents war and peace, unity, and all that. And then it being the eagle was the most revered bird in our culture. So as far as their system goes, I love their system because their system is based off of ours, right? What I don't love about it is they found a way to pervert it, and it doesn't work for the people. And the only thing that works over there is money. Money is your voice.
Well, you're not wrong about that. I definitely agree that money would be your voice, and that's
where the democracy is starting to fail. Is that they're only listening to the money. They're not listening to the people and the things that matter.
So jumping off of that, Cuz, what are your concerns, or what concerns do you have about the growing relationship between technology and democracy? Because that's really the meat of the potatoes here we're getting to.
I think technology is a great way for getting the information out there. But as we've seen with the last 4 years of the Trump era, you can have that misinformation and that willful thorn in the side that just wants to see mayhem, we'll say. Because there's and not to pick on anybody that's vaccinated or not vaccinated. I'm just going to use this topic in general. It became a politicized topic, so now when people look at it or they discuss it, they're looking at it from whatever political standpoint they have. When in actuality, we should be looking at it from a scientific standpoint.
Yeah,
that's really all that matters. And that I would say is partially social media to blame because it allows that misinformation to go. So the internet is a great tool that can be used for good and for evil. So, I don't know, in the long run, I don't know how to disband the errant lies that are out there, but ultimately I think that anybody that's capable of critical thinking can look past the misleading information that's out there.
Yeah, I think if you're curious, absolutely. And so I guess you kind of led right into, the next question I had for you, which is what are your concerns about digital technologies and social media? And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, right? Is it can be used for good, but it can also be, as we've seen with the Trump era and, the misinformation, fake news era, it can be used for quote unquote bad purposes or, maybe less sincere purposes, right? So, what do you think about the experience of distribution of technologies in North America, right? And that's something that I think is an important question because if you look at the way technology was sort of leveraged against indigenous people in general, it created an imbalance in power, and I feel like well, it doesn't matter what I feel like, but in terms of the question, what do you think about the distribution of technology and how this, has it been equitable? How does this affect democracy, sort of thing?
I think that's a two-pronged question, because in the States, they had that thing for a little while Obama was in office, that they were giving out cell phones to the poor. Mm-hmm. Now, mind you, they weren't the greatest of cell phones, but they worked. And ultimately, that's communication is the key to keeping impoverished areas out of poverty, or at least helping them to remove themselves from poverty. That's in the States, though. So, and even that's the technology divide is still quite huge. For instance, my kids go to school in a decent area in the South Towns of Western New York, and the resources that they have far outweigh the resources that the inner city has. And really, of the two school districts that can afford to have services and not have services, the services should be in the city, not necessarily in the suburbs. Like if we want our country as a whole, both sides of the border, to truly be standing strong for generations to come, then we need that education to be offered across the board to impoverished and affluent areas. So, long story short, I guess there's the States is technology more advanced than we are over in Canada. The divide in Canada is quite large because even on reservations today, I'm not sure how it is on your reservation, but Six Nations, one of the largest reservations in North America, they still don't have a consistent Wi-Fi.
What type of barriers do you see accessing new technologies within your community specifically? Like,
in my community, I would probably say even accessing some of this stuff, because everything is based on credit now. So, I come from a community that's not really high on the credit rating list, if they even have any credit at all. So, these are, most of the people I deal with are either meager means or living check to check. So the extras, again, like I say, in the States, you can get an iPhone for no money down, but you're going to be paying for it on the monthly, but that's not really fair, because somebody that does it that way is going to pay 50 to 100% more for the same product that somebody paid for. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I would say that it's still is easier if it's becoming to access information. It's still hard to access the devices to access that information. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other criticisms of technology, or any other criticisms you hear of, things in the community that sort of maybe moving too quickly, or any sort of gripes within your community? I mean, I've heard some in my community, but those are mainly from, elders and things like that. And
I think one of the things that like, for instance, I know that Native people in general are pushing more for the green technologies, and there's information about these windmills. And, I get that yes, birds do die running into windmills, but they're is it enough to warrant what we're losing due to coal power? You know what I mean? Coal power is obviously destroying huge swaths of habitat.
So you don't really have necessarily a criticism of technology per se, more a criticism of how it's used and.
Yeah, I would say exactly. More how it's used. We have I think I'd be safe to say that we have
not
the
used. Yeah.
Yeah, we have the abilities to supply people with energy at a cheaper rate that's not so detrimental to the earth. Mm-hmm. And we're choosing to still go after the dirty ways of doing things. So we've advanced technologically quite a way, but mechanically we're still in the 19th century.
What is the role of online participation in digital democracy for enhancing consultation and self-governance in First Nation communities?
Well, I think that we've discovered over this last year with COVID that this ability to meet online in these online chat rooms or like Vivo or Duo or whatever there is, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
These platforms have allowed us to be in the same room even though we're great distances apart.
Mm-hmm.
So for Native communities especially, being that they're geographically we are so separate, that I think will help us communicate and work together as separate nation entities. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So it allows us to communicate between communities. I think that the other thing that it allows with social media is that it allows those communities to interact in a social platform. I myself not necessarily active on Facebook with my own stuff, but there's always some kind of event going on or some kind of acknowledgement. And we between our communities, we share these things on our social platform, therefore allowing our other networks to see each other. And then from that, like I say, now you have, amongst those people, you have community organizers who are going to be in these meetings who do have a better understanding of what's going on, say in Niagara Falls or Fort Erie or Wiki or Kamloops or Ganawagi or wherever.
Yeah.
So all these geographically far places can now meet, and we all have different issues that are plaguing our communities, but our root problems are pretty much all the same.
So do you think the social media movements, I Don't Know More, Wet'suwet'en, Students Against TMX, what do you think the impact of that has been?
I think if nothing else, it's at least been out there for people to become aware, or at least teach themselves on what's going on and what the issue is. There was a time where the citizenship of Canada and America could plead ignorance and not knowing. But with the social media and these different groups on there's no longer that ability to claim that you don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. There's no, you can't say that, I didn't know anymore. That's no longer an excuse. And I think that's what's going to come now, especially with the children in the residential school with their finding on their properties.
Yeah, I don't like the whole I didn't know excuse, because you may not have been explicitly told, you may not have known exactly where the bodies were, but if you were aware of the system or had any peripheral understanding, and you heard about what residential schools were in that entire process, either you didn't care enough to think laterally, like, oh, what did that mean and what actually happened to these kids, or I don't know what the other alternative is, but it's a frustrating subject for a lot of people to plead ignorance when they're very much aware that there's indigenous communities here, and it sucks what happened to the Indians, and that's sort of like, I don't know if it's pity or what it is, but I don't want their pity myself. I don't care about the Every Child Matters thing in the way that maybe other people do, because I feel like that's just more placating to settlers. Like, maybe they'll listen now that they feel sorry for us. Like, I don't know if the whole...
Do you see where I'm coming from, at least? I don't expect you to agree, and I know it's controversial. I know other indigenous people don't necessarily feel like me. I see the stuff. I went back to my res. I saw the stuff in the yard.
If I didn't go on my journey, I would definitely feel that way. In fact, I'd probably be holding a lot of hate in my heart, because there's no excuse for what happened.
Have there been cases of government censorship, suppression, restriction of indigenous movements?
If you take a look at Conestoga, is the site that they have 6x6, the free space at Landback, where anybody can go there. So if they want to go support Landback and not get arrested, they can go over to 6x6. That's the old Conestoga site from 2006. Now during that time that they were out there, now keep in mind that this is on the Canadian side of the imaginary line. But do you know who was all there? Because you had CSIS, you had OPP, RCMP, CIA, FBI, DEA, and Homeland Security. Because, again, we span a border. So, Mohawk territory is in Canada. Well, guess who's in America? The Senecas, the Cayugas, the Onondaga. But even so, that being said, Homeland Security has a worry for land back. Because land back is now showing its face on reservations in the States.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I don't know if you've seen on the 4th of July, they dropped a land back flag on an American flag. They dropped land back, and it was an upside-down American flag from a grain elevator in South Dakota. Then now, you can even see the indigenous in New Zealand and Australia are land back. Well, and we've even seen certain things being blocked or not being shared through social media. So, yeah, no, I mean, we see it all the time. And heck, look at Standing Rock, for instance. How much airtime did that get on mass media?
Well,
It got none. It got none, you know. So they don't want to take a look at it because they don't want to acknowledge it. They use their media to upset people about Black Lives Matter and real social issues. But you have an issue where that's your drinking water, and they're quiet.
Yeah.
You know. So and again, that's why I can honestly, as much as I don't like Trump, I can honestly understand their argument about why they do. Because they're not lying. Like, the media does show what it wants to show. The only problem is these people that are complaining, they unfortunately have no reason to complain because they don't even know what suffering is yet.
Not yet.
I try to warn people. Like, if you don't want certain things to happen to you, you need to pay attention to what American Canada did to Native people and Black people. Because once they've gotten everything from us, the only people left to take it from is the white people. So again, this is a corporate state. It has nothing to do with race. It has more to do with the
exploitation, right? Yeah, of the lowest man on the rung, right? And so
exactly.
Or experience
systematic barriers, violence, and also the potentials for technology in general. But lastly, before we get off of here, I want to know, what do you want the future to look like?
Future, I think we're working towards that. With the land back movement, that's our people saying we want our land so that we can grow as people too. Like those are our birthrights. Those are the agreements we made. I think that as we educate, I think Canadians are realizing that, yeah, we've been taken advantage of, and that something needs to be done. I'm hopeful that it'll happen, but I'm not going to hold my breath. Again, these are fights that my grandparents and their grandparents have had. So I'm hoping, at the very least, that we can see somewhat of a change between our generation and my children's generation. I hope that my kids have half of what we have to have, as much to fight for as we have to fight for now. Meaning that we've at least taken away some of those burdens for them. There's not a native land that doesn't have some form of Stockholm syndrome. You know,
that's true, man. So true.
We're all basically under the care of our oppressor. So, you know, and to finish this conversation, since we're talking about democracy and social media, in my travels, I've come to hear a lot of people say, well, I don't get political. Well, I tell them that it's your duty as a citizen to be political. And to be a minority in that system, you have no choice but to be political, because a lot of the decisions that they make in those chambers affect us directly, whether it be through education, justice, or housing.
Yeah, man.
You know, so we don't have the luxury to say I don't want to be political. That's not an option for us.
If there's anything else you want to leave our audience with before we go, then by all means, the floor is yours, sir.
I would just say to your be more involved, pay attention to what's going on, and educate yourself on the treaties and who you are. Canadians, as well as Indigenous people, are also treaty people as well, because those agreements weren't just for us; those were agreements for them to follow as well. So, because again, we were people of the earth more so. So there's our ways can help us with a lot of what's going on now. And I think our ways are a lot, whether there be a Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, or Helsink, or whatever, Sioux, whatever, they all come back to a single creation, and the earth is our mother. And I think that's honestly what society needs the most. They need to remember who their, I know I'm using this word, but who their true God is. And their true God is creation. You know, one hand washes the other. The trees give us air. You know, it's a reciprocal relationship.
Because I'm always humbled listening to you speak, and again, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and ideas, and again making some time for just participation.
Anytime, man. Anytime. I'm happy to share any information I got. Because someday I will pass away, and when I'm gone, if I don't share it, it goes with me. And information and knowledge is something that's free to share. It doesn't cost you anything.
Yeah, and more wise words from Cuz. Our following guests are Panini Cantadari and Jesse Carson of Participedia's design technology team. The team was established in 2015 by artist Amber Freed Jimenez, whose aim was to create an intentionally inclusive space and foster student mentorship in the design and development of the open source platform Participedia.net. We spoke to Pan and Jesse about what it has been like to work in a field marked by systematic gender, sex, and racial barriers, and they describe how feminist human-computer interaction theory can help overcome inequalities in design and technology.
So excited to have you both here. I'm really excited to dive in, and actually I wanted, one of our questions sort of builds upon that feminist HCI theory. If you could speak a bit more about that and sort of just introduce that.
Yeah, so feminist HCI stands for human-computer interaction, and it's a practice of design, essentially, of building technology that's rooted in feminist theory and values, essentially. So yeah, anything you can learn about feminism, it's got a long history. That what we really draw from feminism is like an underlying belief in equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that those things are so important in all aspects of work. Not just the output at the end of the technology that you build. Yes, that must be inclusive, and we do our best, but also in the processes that we use to build that technology. So the team itself and how we're engaging with each other, and how can we incorporate and live those values all the way through in sort of a holistic way. So that's kind of what we get from it.
In both of your experiences, are there any other lines of inclusion, sex, race, ability, or disability, where you've seen exclusion, where there still needs to be more of a push? I'm wondering if you both have any ideas of how, someone looking in could be like, okay, why does it matter? Why do we need, for example, an LGBTQ developer? What does that impact the technology itself? Anyone can do this job sort of framework. Would you have any insights that maybe subvert that idea, subvert that notion of why we need an equitable tech workforce?
I mean, it's tech is tech. I think to me, it's when we say equal, it's like anyone does it. It's the same thing. So I'm not really. I guess I'm not saying, hey, we should hire more women or we should hire LGBTQ. It's more like whoever can do the job, or it's then everybody can advance the field. So I'm not sure. That, so,
I mean, that does make sense. And I think hiring people who have the skills, or finding people who want to have the skills and mentoring them to do the work is important, and getting the work done in a good way is important. But I guess from our team's perspective, and why we feel that it's important to have a team, that's made up of women who have maybe some lived experience in dealing with discrimination for different reasons, race, gender, because lived experience influences your output in a way. It's like we can see things maybe that others might not notice in the process of doing the work. Like, Amber, noticed even more than I did as a woman and as a leader of the team early on in phase 1, that the technology that was being built, while it was functional and it was good, but the team that was doing it was almost entirely men, and a lot of the men were from the northern hemisphere and that sort of thing. So it's like we're building this technology that we want to learn about things that are going on globally, but are we taking actions that are a little bit not open enough to do that in a good way? But and it's not like that team was bad or they were exclusionary on purpose or anything like that, but they just didn't have a lot of women involved, and they didn't, maybe because they're not women, they didn't think to have more women. I don't know. It's a tough thing to like speculate about. And sometimes it's just like, well, it's just the way that it's set up. Like, they hired a firm to build the initial platform, right? And so the way the firm works, they didn't have the ability to make the tech open source because it's just not how they did business, right? And they didn't want to do it that way. So because of that, we tried to work with them and see, oh, maybe they can hire students and mentor students to build some of the code as well, but they just couldn't fit it into their business model. And it's not like that's a bad thing, and it's totally okay to have a business model, but that's not the way we wanted to do the work of Participedia, which is supposed to be all about education and really empowering for students. So that's, it's like making those shifts that, I don't know, and maybe Amber, was the one who saw that, and maybe we needed her to see that for everyone. And now everyone's on board now. Oh, well, that's fabulous. Like, this is a good team. Like, of course we should do it this way, but it needed somebody to step up and say it and actually make the changes.
That's a great point you bring up. And I'm so glad you dived into open source data and privatized closed business models. That's sort of the practical aspect of tech that I wanted to get some insight into after. But as a preliminary question, for someone who might not have as much experience in tech, how would you best describe sort of what open source data is and what privatized closed models are with examples?
So open source is when you build a software and everybody can access your source. We are using GitHub as GitHub public repository as a way for people to access the source code. But in general, it just means a software that people can access the source code. So everybody can build on it. Everybody in the community who knows something about tech or want to change something could make change to it. The way our kind of open source work is that everybody can access the source, but in order to merge the change in, they'll have to kind of make a pull request, and we have to approve it. However, they could make a copy of it, host it anywhere. That's open source. And closed source is the opposite of that. So nobody can see or change your code unless you were given permission to.
That was a great summary, thank you. And then I guess from that, are there any tensions between, I don't want to come out right out and say, okay, these are on opposite ends, because they may not be, but are there any tensions between the two, I guess, models of code?
From the technical and business perspective, I don't think there are. It depends on how your business model is, right? I mean, most of the companies who like for-profit company, then obviously most of them will not share their code just because it's proprietary and people can copy it. So I don't think there's like a tension, and some for-profit company, like for example, Google has a lot of open source libraries that developers can use. So it depends on the situation. It's not like a tension between them or.
It totally depends on the situation, absolutely. And I think, on the other side, on the like personnel side, on the team side of tech development, there's the responsibility for making a safe space falls to whoever's on that team, right? So the business, you know, they have an HR department, and there's channels for, you know, making sure that everyone is safe and not being, you know, coming up against barriers and challenges based on race or gender or anything like that. So there's where the responsibility lies. And even in the open source community, that can cause problems as well, right? Because there are less channels and recourse for people who might be facing issues of discrimination or, you know, harassment. And the things happen online that are, you know, can be unsafe and damaging for people. So it's actually it kind of goes, it permeates both sides of the thing. So there's a tension, but there's also like, yeah, everyone's facing these challenges, even the open source community. So it's not like this big savior. You have to make sure that you're doing those things in a way that's inclusive too.
That's a great consideration. Yeah, how open source can even have some inequality as well. From this, I wanted to ask, our larger theme for the season, as you both know, is technology and democracy. And I'm trying to think of examples of how either open source or privatized closed models have been begun to be applied to democratic processes and inclusive practices. I can only think of more privatized closed models. I think I'm thinking of like government and bureaucratic systems. But are there ways that open source data is being used in participatory democracy as well?
It's a good question. I'm trying to think of other examples. I'm not sure if this example uses open source tech or if their project is open source. It might be. Commonfare.net is one that I can think of. We wrote about it in our paper. And they're kind of creating a space online that supports communities. And they're even sort of inventing sort of a community funding system as well. And it's less, I guess it's less about the open source technology side. It's more like they're being generative, you know, they're actively trying to change things in the world. And a lot of closed source projects probably do that too. It's sort of, that's the side. I don't know, for us, the open source piece was really so we could get other people's hands in the code and like get students involved. And that might not be as important a goal for other projects, but who still do really important things to bolster democracy and to like facilitate community engagement. So I don't know if it's like, yeah, I love open source. I think it's great, but I don't think it's like the solution that's going to solve all the problems. It's like really about the people and what they're doing. And, you know, even if it's not open source, is the technology for good? Is it for social good? Or is it, you know, have other agendas?
I think we have to kind of separate between the open source technology itself, which is the code, and source data. So I feel like as like how Participedia is built, regardless of the code that is being open source, the data in there, people could access it, they can export it. And also for the fact that anyone could edit an entry, a case, that already helps a lot with the democracy, because like if you were to compare this to like government website, it's a read only, you don't have a say in it. But with Participedia, everybody has a say to what like to what they see and what they experience. So we build it in a way that if a person puts something up as a case, anybody who disagrees with that could make a change or make a suggestion. Then that's kind of already democracy, you know, like hearing others' voices. So yeah.
Totally, such a good point. And I guess, yeah, another example of that is Wikipedia. That's kind of where we got the name from, right?
Right.
And they do use open source technology and both. But yeah, a good point, Pan. It's like, and it's coming back again to this, like what's going on behind the scenes in the code, and then what's going on the front end, you know, the actual users, and is the site itself democratic? You know, how engaging is it? Can people access the data? They don't have to be a coder to do that, you know? It's a good point.
That's a great point. And I think it's interesting you bring up Wikipedia, because I think I feel as though there's been a recent cultural shift in where before it was heralded as, okay, you can't trust Wikipedia, you know, just anyone can go on and do anything, and don't use it for research, where now I feel like there's a general shift where we're seeing the legitimate and really helpful tools and framework that Wikipedia popularized, and where, again, anyone could go on, be verified as an editor, and really do that research and have all the footnotes at the bottom, to really build such a huge website and foundation of information. So I think it's great that it's having more ripple effects in how Participedia is shaped as well.
Yeah, for sure. And we're definitely facing those same challenges with Participedia that Wikipedia has faced. And you know, as phase 2 of this project has grown the team, there's new people and there's researchers who are new to Participedia saying, hang on a minute, like your data is biased. How are we even supposed to use this? And so that's like one of our big pushes this first phase of phase 2 is to form an editorial board and really dial in our systems for ensuring that the entries that are being used in analysis for academic work, for policy change, all of those important things are really well cited and reviewed by a board and sort of approved. And so for Pan and I, that means a new technical challenge of, do we need, you know, a verified entry system that shows which entries have been reviewed by the board on the site. And then this kind of ethical or sort of philosophical challenge of, but wait, do we lock it? Is it now not open edit? Whoa, hold on, take a step back. So we're in that like interesting space right now, and conversations are happening among the team, and that's a really big part of our co-design work going forward. So stay tuned for that.
That's a great consideration, and something, it brings in like the philosophical questions of, okay, how do we approach this, and building off of that. I wanted to latch on to the phrase you used, or just the 2 words about was it coded bias or biased data?
Yeah, the data being biased.
I think it can be often seen, maybe from those who aren't in tech, you know, how can data itself be biased? Isn't data just, you know, information? Don't you just enter that? And I think there was a documentary on Netflix recently, I think it was called Coded Bias, where it sort of talks about how you know, algorithms use a lot of data to input them, but it's a matter of, you know, who's picking that data and who's all this really cool stuff. But if you wanted to add on to sort of your perspective on how can data be biased?
Yeah, well, it's so many ways.
I think if we talk about Google, so I think the coded bias for data is different than what Jesse just mentioned about. So we are in like the age of machine learning and AI, and in order to so machine learning and AI is used to predict a result, and to do that, you basically teach the machine to think, and to teach the machine to think, you have to have a large set of data that tells the machine saying, okay, so when you see something like this, that's the result, and you have a million of this, and think about like the sample data being wrong, or it's being answered in a way that so if you,
or the example data is like all written by men, or it's a bunch of racist text, or like, you know, there's a whole bunch of problematic things that can come up when it's not being looked at by human eyeballs. You know, they're just gathering it all up. Anyways, keep going, Pan.
Yeah, then those data are biased in a sense of like Google or AI. But I think what Jesse was mentioning is the content of our website, whoever wrote it could be biased.
Exactly. And it's a lot less high tech bias for us. It's like, but it, you know, it's not even intentional. It's like, you know, let's say a researcher who's interested in a particular country, who writes a lot of entries about that country, but doesn't, and then there's a big, huge hole, you know, like there's
And honestly, I definitely don't think it's intentional. From my personal experience, for example, I originally came from Thailand, and if you were to be in Thailand and write something about Thailand is definitely different than being in Canada and look back. Because like it could be the government does not really give you the whole picture, or the access to information is different, and or it's how you view your society compared to others. So there, I think there will always be bias, but that's why we make the data kind of open source. So when a lot of people are able to make the input to that same entries, it makes it less biased, so that you see different point of views. Yeah.
And then there's, we do our best, as researchers. There's a lot of smart people on this team, like amazing academics who have put a lot of time into developing the questions that we ask, the data model itself, like all of these specific nuanced questions about what are democratic innovations and what do we want to know about them and why is that important? And that has to be reviewed, and that's another thing that comes from feminism is like reflection, is looking at what we've done and just pausing, taking a minute and looking back on all of that and saying, okay, how could we have done this better? Does this need to be more inclusive? Did we leave people out who should have been at the table? Like that, those steps. And that, over time reduces bias, over time makes things a bit more inclusive or meets the goals that you want to meet in terms of a global knowledge production product. I think I had another thing I wanted to say, but now I forget. So
hopefully it jumps back. But this,
yeah.
I like a lot where we'd gone, and I think sort of coming back to the feminist theory that's at the center of the practice, it has been very, very insightful. I wanted to ask in terms of larger implications of this, because I know there definitely has been large sources of data that have been coded with bias, and we have already bias within many systems. What could be those larger implications? Connecting it to movements and things that are happening in the world today?
Well, with Participedia, we're not at the stage where it's like big. We're not called big data. We're not big data right now, but we are. So we have the luxury of being able to have human eyeballs on all the data that the team is going to analyze and review. But that's not to say that we are not moving into exploring AI and machine learning. And some of our team members are interested in those things. So some of the implications of those things are, the findings can go into a policy brief that then influences policy change. And did the data come from a place where, this is questionable? So it's always going to be so important to have that discernment and awareness of the dangers of bias. And I think that's why we have one of our research clusters, digital democracy. It's like, okay, how are we being critical about tech and in democracy and using AI for these types of things that can have big picture impact on the world and change the way governments work based on data that, may or may not have been thoroughly vetted for issues like bias. So yeah, it has potential for major impact, but we'll sort of see what happens.
Yeah,
if it's in the hands of the right people, but oftentimes it's not. And the people who are building the most, forward-thinking tech are large corporations, who are firing their women researchers for calling out these very issues. Like, Google fired, is it Kimnet Gibru, who was fired for writing papers about issues and bias in AI. So I don't know. Whose hands is it in? That's always going to go. What's the motivation? So hopefully being part of an academic project who's, research funding and not, capitalist agendas helps.
And it brings a great consideration about a barrier or a problem within tech and democracy not being completely just the tech itself, but the motivations and the individuals behind it, whose hands it's in. A great phrase.
Who do we trust?
Yeah.
Because I don't know if even government at this point, it's hard to trust with all of the chaos, but we do our best.
Yeah. I think technology is it's itself is like just a small thing of that is a tool that helps um the people behind it. So yeah, I think the government we are not sure if the government could be trusted, but at the same time, I don't think any of the citizens see the whole picture of anything either. So it's like a puzzle, you kind of have to put everything together, and yeah.
It's a big data problem. There's too much data. We can't know everything.
Yeah. And from the last interview with Dr. Bunny, he called tech a double-edged sword. And from this one, I'm getting more than a tool that can be wielded by any number of hands. So it's great to see different interpretations of how technology can intersect with democracy, especially from a practical standpoint of two researchers, coders, developers. And I guess I just wanted to ask, was there any final thing you wanted to share, anything that was just on your mind that just popped up during this discussion?
I would love to see everyone visit participedia.net and let us know what you think, because that's a big part of it too. Who's looking at this? What are we meeting your needs? Tell us. You can email info@participedia.net or use the feedback button on the site to shoot us a note.
Our final guest for this episode is Dr. Bonnie Ibawa. Dr. Ibawa is the director of the McMaster Center for Human Rights and Restorative Justice, the project director of the Confronting Atrocity Project, and the project director of Participedia. He currently chairs the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Right to Development and was recently inducted into the Royal Society of Canada. Our conversation centers on the possibilities and tensions of technology and democracy, drawing on his years of personal and research experience.
The first thing I wanted to ask was just generally, within your realm of research, expertise, how do you see technology and democracy interacting? And on top of that, sort of what challenges have you seen come from this?
Yeah, so technology for democracy, I think, is a double-edged sword, if I can put it that way. So on the one hand, we see how technology, particularly in the forms of digital communication and social media, has been so effectively mobilized by marginalized groups to demand a voice in governance, but also to generally, pass their message across. It has brought the community together. It has made a global village even more connected. And all of these enhance democracy, giving citizens a voice and bringing people that would ordinarily maybe not have the opportunity to work and collaborate together. Technology is providing all that new resources that can facilitate interaction, collaboration, civic engagement, both within the context of local communities, national communities, but also in the context of international communities. On the other hand, however, we also increasingly see how technology, the same technology, is being deployed by authoritarian forces to repress participation, to restrict civic engagement, to repress, and to exclude. We see this in the use of surveillance technology, for instance, which many governments are deploying now to kind of surveil citizens. We see this in the ways that technology have been used to fan, anti-immigrant sentiments, xenophobia, populist nationalism. So in some ways, technology is what you make of it. I mean, I think that has always been the historical truth, whether it's the age of the telegram or the age of the telephone or the age of the television.
Yeah.
It's what humans make of the technology. And we see that definitely with the digital revolution, that there are those who are appropriating it to advance the cause of human rights and inclusion and equity and justice. But on the other hand, there are also others that would use the same technology to exclude and to repress.
And I like what you've given us a good overview, especially on the international scale of both sides of technology and democracy. And I wanted to hang on to one thread that you mentioned about that giving a voice to marginalized or historically excluded communities. I do understand that you've done some research onto a mobile polling platform, Voto, through Participedia. If you wanted to, I guess, give the context to what your research in that reign was.
Yeah, that's a good one, because Participedia is essentially about trying to map how local people are demanding a voice in how they're governed. And that's really the beauty of Participedia, that it is crowdsourced. It is trying to capture evolving civic engagement initiative. And Voto Mobile, which is this initiative of a mobile phone-based, polling and crowdsourcing in Ghana, provides us with an excellent example of how technology is driving popular participation. So in this case, it's a phone-based, very basic phone-based platform developed by communities in collaborations with partners, technical partners, and it allows them to monitor elections, to poll, and there's so much potential in what these technology can do. And in the context in which Voto Mobile is being used in Ghana, it's really interesting because, as they say, Africa, like many developing countries, have been able to bridge a major digital divide because of mobile technology. So traditionally, telecommunications required a whole lot of infrastructures. If we're going to create a phone line, for instance, you have to put down the cables and all of that. What digital technology has done, particularly the mobile phones, is that it has allowed developing countries to kind of skip that infrastructure-heavy phase of communications. And so you're finding in Africa that there is wide use of cell phones. And that's what the Voto Mobile initiative has tapped on, to use basic handheld devices that many people in Ghana and across Africa now have access to poll communities and to get them more involved in how they're governed. And we see the same thing in Kenya. I know of several cases where mobile phone-based apps or other forms of digital technology is being used for polling purposes and to get citizens more engaged, either in electoral democratic processes or just be engaged in how they're governed in the issues that affect their lives.
Mm-hmm. And I thought it was super interesting how it was the mobile technology, phones, something portable and brought everywhere, that's really been tapped to in this case with Ghana. Because I feel as though sometimes when we think about technology and democracy here in the Western context, especially with something as I feel sought after as online voting, we think desktops, laptops, and so I think, as you said, they almost jumped a step and went right to phones. And a lot of the benefits with Voto is nurturing that participation and governance. But at the end of the article did say they brought up some interesting challenges. And I think I saw a quote that kind of stuck with me about how technology has the capacity to concentrate power and can reinforce existing power relations. And I wanted to ask, to what degree do you believe that could happen? Especially in terms of online polling and within.
Yes, I agree with you definitely, because while technology has all these impacts, these great impacts that we're talking about, there's still a technological divide. We see it particularly in this pandemic period where everyone had to kind of distance learning and virtual learning. it was quite evident that there is the reality of the technological divide, even in the industrialized West, for instance. In my courses, even here at the university, there were students who emailed me and said, well, I can't attend all the classes because I don't have unlimited, bandwidth. I don't have unlimited internet. So I might have to phone in sometimes to join the classes. So this raises so much equity issues. And the same is true, or perhaps even more so, in a developing country like, say, Ghana, where, yes, there is growing access to technology, but that divide still exists. So, for instance, if you talk about web-based technology that, for instance, rely on apps, you have to have a particular kind of phone to be able to use an app. So you have to have a smartphone.
Yeah.
And very many people in the developing world do not have a smartphone. They do have phones, but they're not smartphones. They won't work with apps. They will work with text messages. They will work with some basic form of digital communication, but not with apps. So if you say, well, we want to develop an app that will kind of aggregate, ideas in rural communities, I think the first question you're going to ask is, okay, one, how many people have smartphones that can, access apps? And two, is there enough bandwidth to even begin to talk about using app? And what other ways can we draw on digital technology that is more inclusive?
Yeah, I'm really glad we've gone in this direction, because it goes sort of right back into the realm of human rights work. And one potential problem with technology and democracy being, okay, if we want to rely on it so much, should this be a human right?
Yes, it should be a human right. If it's going to be the place we go to access information, to determine who is counted and who is not, it becomes a human rights issue. And it's already been discussed in that context, access to the internet as a human right.
Yeah.
Because so much is connected to it. To book a COVID vaccine test, you have to have access. It's done online. To attend lectures, you have to do that online. To book a doctor's appointment, you have to do that online. And increasingly, we're beginning to see that that's often the only way to do it. Yeah. And so it's not just a luxury anymore that, I have to have access to this technology. It's almost a basic necessity of life. But there are also skeptics who say, well, we have to keep human rights basic. We can make internet a human rights, but we've had these arguments before within human rights scholarship, even those who argue that health and education shouldn't be a human right. But they would rather have you limit human rights to the most basic human rights, a right to life, freedom from torture, and all of that. But the question that I ask those people is, what is basic, And I would argue that in some ways, digital access today is basic. It's a basic requirement. That's how you function in society. So we should think about digital access in terms of human rights, I think.
Yeah. And Uncle Bunny, I also want to highlight your role as chair of the UN expert mechanism on the right to development, and sort of filter in this question of how might the UN or these international bodies be addressing or not addressing these roles and challenges of technology integrating itself as a human right?
Yeah, good question. So my role at the UN, I chair the expert mechanism on the right to development. So the expert mechanism in the United Nations is a body of experts that work with the UN to promote specific human rights goals. And in my case, my mandate is to help the UN promote the right to development as an independent expert. And the right to development basically is an all-encompassing right that states that people have an inalienable right, that is an undeniable right, to be part of how matters affecting them and their development and their well-being are determined. And it's a broad spectrum of rights that spans from education to health, to self-determination, to access to economic resources. They are more social and economic oriented rights, but they also have a civil and political rights component to it. Okay. But to go back to the question of digital access and the benefits of digital technology, I think international organizations have an important role to play in ensuring equity and equal access. One of the things that the COVID pandemic has really brought to light is the gaping disparities and inequalities within and between nations. You can see it in terms of who's getting access to vaccines and who's not. And the same is true of digital access and access to basic digital technology, that there is a divide within and between nations. And what the international organizations like the UN has been trying to do is to address both of them, both these global disparities in such a way that are more equitable, but also holding countries up to their obligations to bridge the digital divide within their countries. Because these, like I said before, are equity issues. Digital technology it's not just a nice to have at this stage, it is a must have to function in our world. So increasingly we are beginning to see the human rights language being applied to questions of equity and access to digital technology, and also bridging the digital divide.
Wow, that's really interesting to hear. I wanted to sort of step into that because I feel like often, you know, the UN seems like such a huge organization, and international cooperation in bridging really big topics like digital divide can seem just so insurmountable. If you were to break it down and think of any particular examples or particular cases that you've worked on or you've heard of within the UN that you were like, oh, this really promoted this positive thing, or oh, this could use a little work. Would you have any examples like that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that relates more directly to the right to development is just in terms of technology, access to internet technology. This is something that the UN has been involved in trying to share international support, both in terms of, you know, donor support, but also in terms of working with international agencies such as the World Trade Organization, such as the International Monetary Fund, and of course also the World Bank, to provide particularly least developing countries. So in the UN, we have various categories. You have the developed countries, the developing countries, and there's a category called the least developing countries, and those are the countries that using social and economic indices are rather at the bottom of the development index. But providing those countries with the resources and the support to build digital infrastructure. Very often the emphasis is on just providing basic resources like food, like shelter, like water. And that's important. I mean, for those who are most deprived, these will continue to be the most basic necessities. But what the UN is also pushing for is that, you know, we also need to pay attention to how digital divide facilitates every other thing. And I'll give you a classic example. If farmers, for instance, have access to meteorological information on their handheld device that tells them, you know, what the weather is going to be like for the next 1 week, when it will be good to plant and when not to plant, when to harvest, that obviously has a bearing on food production.
Yeah.
So you see that often we don't make that connection. And I hear very often people say, oh, well, the digital divide and, you know, internet, that's a luxury. We shouldn't be focusing on that. And I keep saying, well, in the world we live in today, you can divorce them. If you're really interested in increasing food production in Kenya, it doesn't make sense not to pay some attention to farmers having access to internet. Even something as basic as international prices of food, of the food they produce. Because I gave an example of a case in Kenya where local producers of tea and coffee were being shortchanged by middlemen who were offering them prices much, much less than the international market prices. And so these farmers got together in a cooperative and said, well, we know what the international market prices are. We've seen it. Here it is on the internet. We know how much you're getting. We know what your cut is. And we demand that, we get a fair price. We get a fair part of that price. I mean, that's just an example of the power of digital technology, even at a subsistence level. So we must begin to think about technology and access to information, not as some luxury as it might have been 20, 30 years ago, but as really fundamental to the other questions that we try to address.
Yeah, that's a great point, that one of the issues with tech and democracy could be how we perceive it and how much of a necessity we perceive it as, especially with, I think in terms of agricultural trade liberalization as well. I know the World Trade Organization had the Doha round in the early 2000s that was never completed. And that was, the effort of that was to essentially get these developing countries to be able to be on the same level in terms of their agriculture heavy based economies. And it was never completed. But then you mentioned how, these farmers can have some sort of agency themselves in checking and comparing food prices and not being shortchanged. So I think, just like the approach of how much of a necessity it is and not just a luxury is an unfortunate issue there.
And we live in a globalizing world now. And this is the other thing that Participedia is really interested in, that, very often we talk about North-South connection, but also that's increasing emphasis now on what's called South-South learning, how are farmers in the South learning from each other. So with internet technology, with WhatsApp groups, farmers in Ghana and farmers in Sierra Leone can compare notes, how are you dealing with, the rains and, the limited rains and harvest today. And those can say, well, this is what we're doing and this is what's working and this is what's not working. So if those are examples of how, digital technology can be useful in really bridging that gap and also fostering South-South cooperation so that people who are in the same boat basically don't have to reinvent the wheel when they're trying to find solutions to local problems. They can draw on the resources around them that others have, attempted and found successful to build them. So there is a limitless possibilities for how digital technology can really enhance the lives of ordinary people in ways that we often don't realize.
Shifting gears a little bit, I wanted to inquire about some problems in another uses of technology, two ways. The first one I want to talk about was sort of, who's going to be delivering this technology. It'll be companies, and these companies are often or can be private companies. And I wanted to ask about what issues you foresee with that. And then we'll counterweight it with issues which might be with state production and state delivery as well.
Yeah, I mean, technology is driven by corporations, by private initiative, and there will always be the role of innovation and private capital in driving technology. I mean, that has historically been true. The internet and all the wonderful, digital technological innovations we enjoy today have come about because of that entrepreneurial spirit, driven, of course, by private capital. But one of the things we also emphasize is that it's not enough to leave private capital and industries alone to do this. The state has to intervene to enhance equity because, entrepreneurship will always be driven by profits. I mean, that's companies do charity and humanitarian work every once in a while, but the ultimate goal is to make profits for their shareholders, and that's going to always be the driver. And I think that is where the state comes in. That's where the government comes in, to ensure that technology is driven in such a way that access is guaranteed. Some level of access is guaranteed.
That's interesting. I feel like there's been many contemporary examples of state intervention within these tech giants. The one that jumps to my mind is the US-based company Facebook.
Yes.
Speaking to, I believe it was the Senate or the GOP, one of the big legislative bodies, just to be held accountable in terms of their election practices.
Yes. I mean, that's a good example of why we can't just say, well, let the companies take care of it. There has to be someone looking out for the public, for the people, and that's what our elected representatives should be doing. And I think Europe has done a better job of this than North America. Europe seems to be the vanguard of trying to rein in the excesses of technology companies.
Was there anything else that you wanted to bring up, or anything else that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I wanted to just end by saying this is a wonderful idea. I think it's a great thing you are starting with technology, because that is one of the things Participedia has been grappling with, because we, as you know, Participedia is crowdsourced. We rely on people to provide this information. So it's also, we have a moral obligation to make the information accessible to those who help us, the content providers, the content contributors. So one of the things we've been grappling with Participedia is, how do we do that? So something as simple as making sure that our website is mobile friendly, because as you know, in many parts of the developing world, people can only access the internet through their phones. They don't have the luxury of desktops and iPads and all of that. So we have been working really hard to make sure that our website, our platforms, all these resources, we're investing in technology, and we have a great design and tech team, that they pay attention to accessibility, and not just the format, but also in terms of disability, that we make our platforms accessible to people around the world as much as we can. So in some ways, paying attention to digital technology and to technology generally is really central to what we do, and it's a key determinant of the success or failure of so many of our projects and initiatives. So it's a great thing we're having this conversation.
And that will conclude this episode of Just Participation today. We would like to thank our guests for sharing their time, as well as the production team, Adiola, Nadim, Tim, and Zaina, and Participedia, for whom makes this work possible. If you found this episode worth listening to, please share it and subscribe. Until next time, miigwech.